When the air raid sirens began, survival didn't start with running. It started with remembering where the beams had fallen last. In cities crushed by nightly bombings, families didn't wait for aid. They turned toward whatever remained: splintered doors, shattered wardrobes, scorched floorboards. These weren't meant to protect life, but they had to, because basements were flooded. Cellars had cracks, and the next blast didn't care if the walls were ready. We think of shelter as something pre-built, reinforced, engineered by experts. But in 1942, protection came from pieces of the past. A broken bed frame became a ceiling brace, a dining table became a blast shield. Even crib rails, once symbols of innocence, were nailed across collapsing beams. These weren't fixes, they were transformations. Families didn't repair, they repurposed. And in doing so, they rewrote the very idea of shelter, using nothing but instinct, memory, and what the bomb hadn't taken yet. In this film, you'll uncover 8 forgotten techniques that turned furniture into fortresses and households into holdouts. Hit like and subscribe to rediscover the skills our ancestors never wanted us to forget. Number 1. Table brace. In the bombed-out neighborhoods of London, dinner tables weren't cleared after meals, they were turned upside down and nailed into place. When ceilings cracked and brick dust rained from above, families didn't run. They reinforced. With no access to hardware stores, no delivery trucks bringing timber, and no warning when the next shockwave would hit, they reached for what was already there. The hardwood table, once the center of family meals, became a shield overhead. Heavy, flat, and already built to bear weight, it was one of the few items strong enough to counter falling plaster and warped ceiling beams. Children who once did homework on it now lay beneath it, hoping it would hold. This wasn't done with blueprints, it was done with instinct. Tables were flipped upside down, legs pointed upward like pillars. Some were wedged between the floor and the sagging roof above. Others were laid across support beams with bricks stacked on top to anchor them in place. The logic was simple. Distribute the force of a collapse across something that had already survived 100 family dinners, dozens of storms, and decades of use. In homes where the upper floors were gone, these tables helped preserve what little shelter remained below. Some families used more than one. A pair of tables, pushed side by side, covered entire sleeping areas. Others added drawers or cabinet shelves across the legs to form barriers from dust and debris. Cloth was draped over the edges to contain fragments in case of an impact. There was no illusion that it made the space safe, but it made it survivable, and that difference mattered. Many who built these braces weren't engineers. They were mothers, grandfathers, neighbors, people who had no choice but to act with what was left. They didn't speak in terms like load-bearing or shock dispersion. They just knew the ceiling had cracked again, and they couldn't afford to wait. So they lifted the table, found a spot that might hold, and built downward from what once stood for comfort. The war took walls, windows, and rooftops, but the table remained. This wasn't furniture. It was family, flipped into defiance. One forgotten skill, one more day alive. Or day. Number 2. Iron bedframe wall cage. In the shattered districts of Hamburg, the coldest thing in the house became its strongest defense. Families who had once slept under soft blankets now found themselves beneath rusted iron. Old bedframes, often bent, scorched, or missing bolts, were pulled from bedrooms and carried down crumbling staircases into the lowest corners of the home. They weren't used for comfort anymore. They were turned on their sides, braced against walls, and bolted together to catch what the house could no longer hold. When outer walls cracked and bricks loosened from nightly blasts, nothing inside could stop the collapse. But metal, dense, rigid, and already shaped for weight-bearing, offered a chance. Bed frames from the pre-war years were made of thick iron bars, often curved but solid. They didn't shatter like wood. They bent and then they held. In many homes, these frames were linked side by side like a cage. Wired to pipes, wedged into corners, and bound with belts or cord, they formed an inner lining to weak cellar walls. Their job wasn't to stop a full collapse, it was to slow it, delay the fall, Keep one more brick from landing where a child slept. This transformation didn't begin with instructions. It began with memory. Families remembered how strong these beds once were, how they groaned under weight but never gave way. And that memory became action. Some drove nails through the feet and fixed them into joists. Others tied them to support columns using window wire or rope from the attic. Where bolts were missing, spoons were hammered flat and used as brackets. Nothing was wasted. Not a single slat, not a single hinge. In the quiet hours after curfew, fathers worked by candlelight while mothers held flashlights low to the ground. They didn't talk much. Every sound echoed. But every clang, every twist of wire, every measured push against the frame was a step towards safety. The result wasn't elegant. It didn't look like protection. But it was. And when the ceiling trembled or the wind shook loose another corner of plaster, those iron bones held their ground. Sometimes that's all survival asked for, just a few more seconds. Just one more layer between life and what came crashing down. The iron bed frame never slept again, but it never stopped holding. This wasn't comfort. It was calculation beneath collapse. It's a method modern prepping still hasn't reclaimed. Number 3. Door shield. In the narrow corridors of Warsaw's apartment blocks, the safest place in the house wasn't a room. It was behind a door that no longer opened. When buildings groaned under pressure and windows exploded without warning, there was little time to react. But families learned quickly that not all destruction came from collapse. Much of it flew through the air, glass, tile, brick fragments, all moving faster than thought. That's when doors, especially from heavy cabinets and wardrobes, found new purpose. Large wooden doors were removed from furniture and stripped of hinges. Some came from hallway closets, others from bedroom wardrobes, thick panels, flat and weighty. They weren't perfect shields, but they had mass, density, and familiarity. And that was enough to make them useful. Families placed them across doorways and entry arches, not to block people, but to intercept debris. In hallways where the outer wall was exposed, a cabinet door could be propped upright and braced with furniture to form a makeshift inner wall. Behind it, children sat. Elderly parents rested. Meals were eaten in silence behind barriers never built for defense. In some cases, doors were leaned against the inside of windows, reinforced with stacked books or bricks. If glass shattered inward, the wood would catch it first. It didn't stop everything, but it slowed the storm. Some took extra steps, adding layers of cloth, stuffing blankets into the gaps, or tying pillows to the front using bed sheets. These additions weren't sophisticated, but they turned a flat surface into something that could absorb shock and reduce harm. They called it improvisation. But it was more than that. It was an adaptation born under pressure, quick decisions made with trembling hands and old hinges. The real genius wasn't in the wood. It was in knowing what could be used, what no longer served its original purpose, but still had strength left to give. No training manual taught this. No diagram showed where to place the support. But across hundreds of homes, these barriers began to appear. Silent, simple, and ready. And when the walls cracked or the ceiling shifted, the door caught more than just splinters. It caught time. The seconds needed to breathe, to move, to survive. It wasn't security. It was instinct nailed to memory. This wasn't just survival. It was memory passed down in silence. Number 4 chair lock. In the trembling stairwells of Rotterdam, the quiet creak of wood was often the only thing keeping the ceiling from falling. Old wooden chairs, damaged, uneven, and forgotten in corners, became unlikely pillars in homes no longer built to stand. When roof beams sagged and floorboards above groaned with every shake, families didn't wait for collapse. They reached for what was already broken. Chairs, especially those made from solid oak or beech, held a secret strength. Designed to carry weight and pressure from above, they were already shaped to resist downward force. And in a home where every crack widened by the hour, that strength became a lifeline. One by one, chairs were flipped upside down or set upright beneath weak spots in the ceiling. Their backs were braced against floor joists, legs were wedged into floor tiles. Some were hammered slightly wider, locking them tightly between top and bottom like vertical clamps. It wasn't about replacing structure, it was about delaying collapse, about holding just long enough to matter. The technique spread quietly. Neighbors borrowed the idea after watching it work next door. A single chair, placed beneath a corner beam, could stop it from dipping further. Add two more, and a room could stay standing another week. Families often used multiple pieces. Broken chairs were cut, their legs nailed into door frames or walls. Seats were removed and flattened into patches for rotted planks. Whatever didn't fit was burned for warmth, but the rest stayed behind, locked in place, doing what it had never been built to do. At night, you could hear them. A soft groan, a tightening sound when the house shifted. A reminder that something was still holding even when the rest felt ready to give way. These weren't repairs, they were interventions. Quiet, untrained hands using logic and memory to stop the inevitable, if only for another day. No one called them engineers, no one had blueprints, but every time a roof beam paused, instead of falling, a lesson was learned. That strength doesn't always come from steel. Sometimes it comes from what's already cracked, but refuses to quit. The chair never sat again, but it stood where no one else could. This wasn't furniture. It was resistance shaped from splinters. Tech fails, but this method never did. Number 5, crib rails. In the cracked walls of Berlin's apartments, even innocence was dismantled for survival. Old baby cribs, once painted with care and placed near windows for sunlight, were taken apart piece by piece. Not because they were broken, but because they were strong. Made of hardwood, built to last, and lined with narrow rails spaced perfectly apart, these cribs had more to offer than comfort. They offered structure. When blasts tore through rooftops and created long fractures in the walls, families searched for anything they could use to stop the spread. Crib rails, light but solid, became a natural answer. Stripped from their frames, they were slotted into the gaps between bricks or nailed across cracked plaster like ribs over a wound. Each slat became part of a larger lattice, angled across corner joints, crisscrossed between stair supports, tied with curtain string, or held in place with bent nails. The goal wasn't to rebuild, it was to buy time. Slow the break. Give one more night of shelter where ceilings had started to drift from the walls. Mothers who once tucked their children in now pulled the beds apart with steady hands. They weren't just breaking furniture, they were rebuilding safety in pieces. The work was quiet, not out of secrecy, but because the world outside already made too much noise. Inside, focus replaced fear. Each slat removed, each rail positioned, was a small act of control in a home that had none left. What made crib rails unique was their size. Easy to manage, thin enough to fit into crevices, but strong enough not to snap. They bent only slightly, absorbing pressure across small surfaces, keeping dust from falling in waves. Sometimes they were used to form braces across cellar ceilings. Other times, stacked vertically in door frames to support shifting lintels. The same design that once protected infants from falling now held the house from breaking. They weren't perfect, but they were just enough. And for the people who had lost everything else, just enough was all they needed. The crib never held a child again, but it held something else, continuity, proof that what once sheltered life could still defend it, even in ruin. It wasn't just a bed, it was memory nailed into the cracks. One forgotten skill, one more day alive. Number 6, crossbar door. In the half-collapsed stairwells of Kiev, it wasn't stone or steel that held the structure together. It was a door turned sideways and nailed into place. When the central supports of a home gave way and the weight of upper floors pressed downward, time became the most valuable thing. Not tools, not plans, just time. and one of the simplest, most reliable ways to create it came from a heavy wooden door, repurposed not for entry, but for endurance. Front doors, closet doors, even broken inner room panels were laid flat across gaps where beams had failed. In stairwells where one step no longer touched the next, doors were wedged into position, bridging empty space with solid weight. The goal wasn't elegance, it was distribution. A wide, dense object could carry pressure over a broader area, slowing collapse and allowing movement between spaces that were already falling apart. In some homes, doors were angled and nailed directly into fractured walls, serving as diagonal braces. In others, they were lowered horizontally between cellar posts to act as shelves for bricks and stones, reinforcing the base from below. The hardware mattered less than the wood itself. Old doors, especially pre-war ones, were often made from thick hardwood, oak, maple, even pine, aged and cured by time, strong enough to resist splitting under sudden pressure. The same panel that once kept the cold out now kept disaster at bay. Families worked fast. Doors were removed with crowbars, screwdrivers, or, if nothing else, bare hands. Hinges snapped, paint cracked, the polished surface scraped against brick and dust. But the transformation happened anyway. Sometimes a single door stood between the family and a blocked exit. Other times, it simply allowed them to rest one more night beneath a ceiling they no longer trusted. Children asked why their rooms were gone, why the hallway was crooked. Parents pointed to the wooden board now nailed above their heads and said, "That's why we're still here." There were no instructions, just memory, weight, and urgency. What once swung open to welcome guests now stood firm against the world outside. And for those few precious hours before the next siren, it held. This wasn't protection, it was purpose nailed across the void. One forgotten skill, one more day alive. Number 7, soap blankets. In the dim corners of Milan's basements, soaked fabric hung like curtains, but they weren't for privacy. They were a family's last defense against flame. During incendiary raids, fire moved faster than most people could think. Wood-framed homes filled with cloth, paper, and dry beams turned into tinder boxes within minutes. Buckets of water sat near the door, but when sparks fell from above and smoke crawled through the cracks, there wasn't time to fetch more. That's when blankets, ordinary heavy wool blankets, were pulled from beds, dipped in soap water, and nailed to walls. This wasn't something taught in school. It came from memory, from grandmothers who remembered boiling laundry in tubs, from parents who understood that wet fabric could stop a spark if caught fast enough. But it wasn't just water that made the difference. It was soap. Families added laundry soap to every bucket. Thick, lathery, and slow to dry, it turned wet blankets into basic flame barriers. When hung across door frames, wall gaps, or even overhead, these soaked cloths could absorb heat, slow ignition, and trap smoke. They bought time, sometimes only seconds, sometimes enough to survive. The technique spread quickly. A neighbor would try it after hearing how it worked 2 streets over. Wool was best, dense, fire-resistant by nature. But even cotton could be used in layers, anything that held moisture and didn't drip too quickly. Blankets were prepared in advance, rolled and stored in corners. Some were permanently hung in shelter rooms, re-soaked every few days. Children helped carry water. Parents stirred the soap into a cloudy mixture, the same way they once cleaned clothes. In many homes, the smell of soap lingered even after the flames were gone. These blankets didn't save the house. That was never the goal. They saved the air, the lungs, the space needed to crawl, to think, to move before it was too late. And when the fire passed, the fabric still hung there, charred at the edges, dripping, blackened, but still intact, still standing where the wall had burned. People didn't talk about this much after the war. It wasn't heroic. It didn't sound like resistance, but in truth, it was both. Because every time someone soaked a blanket in soap water and nailed it to a wall, they were saying one simple thing: we're not done yet. This wasn't a barrier. It was a promise hanging wet in the dark. Number 8, Book wall. In the quiet neighborhoods of Prague, the bookshelf didn't fall when the ceiling did, and that's when people started to notice. It began with a single room. A blast shattered the upper floors, sent windows inward, and knocked everything loose except for a shelf packed tight with thick, hard-bound volumes. The wall behind it cracked. The ceiling above it sagged. But the books didn't move. They absorbed the impact. They held the line. Soon after, word spread. Books weren't just for reading anymore. They could stop something heavier than silence. Families began turning their shelves sideways, dragging them into basements and stairwells. Some removed the legs entirely and laid the books flat. Others stacked crates, filled them with every volume they could find, and lined them against outer walls. Not because the words inside could protect them, but because the weight of those words could. Hardcovers worked best. Encyclopedias, dictionaries, thick religious texts, anything dense enough to resist pressure and slow debris. Layers were key. Not just one shelf, but two. Not just against a wall, but at an angle redirecting force away from where people slept. Children helped, dragging books across floors, stacking them carefully, pressing their palms to the bindings. They didn't understand every story inside, but they understood what the books were doing now. They weren't for learning anymore. They were for lasting. The pages didn't burn easily, the covers didn't break quickly, and when tied together with string or wrapped in old blankets, these shelves became something else, an internal wall, one that could be built without tools, one that could stand without nails. Some households went further. They filled old dressers with books, moved them against exposed corners, and stuffed the spaces behind with sand or fabric scraps. Each new layer bought time. Each book absorbed shock. When rubble fell, it didn't scatter, it stopped. What made this method special wasn't just its logic, it was its poetry. Stories once told now became structure. Words once written to inspire now physically protected the ones who read them. The book wall wasn't decoration. It was transformation. And when all else failed, it remained, bent, burned, covered in dust, but still upright. Because in a world falling apart, even paper could become protection. This wasn't knowledge. It was armor made from memory. It's a method modern prepping still hasn't reclaimed. Now you understand survival wasn't always loud. Sometimes it sounded like a chair wedged under a beam, a door nailed across a crack, a book pressed tight between the bricks. They didn't have safety codes, disaster manuals, or evacuation plans. All they had were the broken remains of the homes they once trusted, and the will to rebuild them piece by piece. And what held those shelters together wasn't just wood, metal, or cloth. It was memory, the kind passed down without words, the kind that taught you to look at a table and see not a place to eat, but a reason to keep breathing. Today, we've traded that instinct for convenience. We scroll through answers, hoping the power stays on. But they didn't wait. They didn't wonder. They adapted with what they had because they knew no one else was coming. And now, their forgotten skills lie buried not in books or vaults, but in stories like this. If even one of them survives through you, their work wasn't wasted. Want more lost wisdom like this? Hit like and subscribe. We're just getting started. One subscription helps revive the knowledge they once used to survive.